The first siren cut through the morning fog like a knife through ice, sharp and unmistakable. I remember glancing up from the still surface of the lake, my fishing line trembling ever so slightly, and thinking how strange it was that a sound so aggressive could exist in a place so quiet. The water was glassy, reflecting the pale Alaskan sky, and the only other noise had been the rhythmic flap of a loon's wings somewhere behind the tree line. Then came the second siren. Louder, closer. I didn't panic. At first, I was standing on my own land, boots sunk into the soft mud at the edge of my lake, doing what I'd done 100 times before. Fishing, breathing, living. The mist curled around the pines like smoke from an old campfire, and for a split second I thought maybe the world had finally caught up with me, that peace was never meant to last. When the police cruiser appeared at the far end of the gravel road, lights flashing blue and red against the trees, I laughed. A short, confused laugh. There had to be a mistake. No one called the cops over a fishing rod and a thermos of bad coffee. No one sane. Anyway, but as the officer stepped out of the car, hand resting just a little too close to his holster, I realized this wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a message. Someone had decided that my lake, my ranch, my life didn't belong to me anymore. And that single phone call, made by a homeowners association that had overplayed its hand, would eventually cost them everything. Their reputation, their power, and $1.2 million they never saw coming. That morning, though, all I knew was that the quiet was gone, and nothing would ever be the same again. The lake had been part of my life longer than most people. I bought the ranch 15 years earlier, long before the HOA existed, back when the land was just land. No covenants, no committees, no laminated rule books telling grown adults how to live. It sat on the edge of a valley that locals barely acknowledged, a patchwork of spruce, alder, and stubborn grass that refused to die even in winter. The lake itself was spring-fed, cold and clear, with trout that fought like they had something to prove. I didn't build the ranch to impress anyone. I built it to disappear. For the first decade, I had neighbors but no problems. People waved. Sometimes we shared firewood or traded fish for moose meat. Then the development came. Luxury wilderness living, the brochure said. Cabins went up, then bigger houses, then fences that didn't make sense in a place where wildlife ignored property lines. And finally, the HOA. At first, they left me alone. I wasn't part of their development, and I made that clear. My land deed predated their paperwork by years, and my access road didn't cross theirs. Legally, I was untouchable. Socially, though, that's where things got interesting. I didn't attend their meetings. I didn't pay their fees. I didn't ask permission. That alone was enough to make me a problem. The complaint started small. A letter about unsightly equipment after I parked my old tractor near the tree line. A suggestion that I coordinate fishing activities because some residents felt uncomfortable seeing someone near the water. Near my water. I ignored them. Alaska teaches you early that not every voice deserves an answer. But the HOA didn't understand that kind of silence. To them, silence meant defiance. The morning they called the police, I had woken up before sunrise. The lake was at its best then. No wind, no insects, just that heavy, expectant stillness that feels like the world holding its breath. I cast my line and thought about nothing at all, which is a rare and valuable thing. Then the sirens came. The officer approached carefully, eyes scanning the shoreline, the trees, my hands. I set the rod down slowly and raised my palms, more amused and offended. "Morning," I said. "You folks lost." He didn't smile. "Sir, we got a call about illegal fishing activity." I stared at him. Illegal fishing on my own lake. He checked his notes. "Caller says this is a private community lake and that you're trespassing." That's when I felt it. Not anger yet, but something colder. The kind of calm that settles in right before a storm. I told him my name. I told him about the deed. I told him the lake was entirely within my property boundaries. He listened, professional but cautious, radio crackling softly on his shoulder. It took 40 minutes for the truth to sink in. 40 minutes of phone calls, GPS maps, county records pulled up on a tablet balance on the hood of a cruiser. By the end of it, the officer's posture had changed. Less suspicion, more embarrassment. "I'm sorry, sir," he said finally. You're absolutely within your rights. I nodded. I know. He hesitated. You might want to talk to a lawyer. That was the moment I realized this wasn't just about fishing. This was about control. The HOA had crossed a line they didn't even know existed. And by involving the police, they'd left a paper trail so clear it might as well have been highlighted in red. As the cruiser drove away and the sirens faded back into the mountains, I picked up my rod and recast my line. The water rippled, then settled. I didn't catch a fish that morning. What I caught instead was a glimpse of how expensive arrogance can be. By the time the sun climbed high enough to burn off the fog, the lake looked normal again. Peaceful, innocent, like it hadn't just been the scene of a small but significant invasion. I packed up my gear slowly, not because I was shaken, but because my mind was already moving faster than my hands. Years in Alaska teach you to read signs, weather, animals, people. And that morning had all the signs of something bigger coming. The officer's words echoed in my head. You might want to talk to a lawyer. I'd never needed one before. I paid my taxes, respected boundaries, and kept to myself. But I also knew bullies don't stop when you ignore them. They escalate, especially the kind that wear pressed khakis and call themselves a board. By noon, I was sitting at my kitchen table with my laptop open, deed documents spread out like a poker hand. I pulled up county maps, satellite images, survey records. Everything I already knew was there in black and white. The lake sat entirely within my property lines. Not shared, not communal. Mine. The access road? Mine too. The HOA development stopped nearly half a mile short. So how did they convince themselves otherwise? The answer came quicker than I expected. At 2:17 p.m., my phone buzzed with an email from the HOA. No greeting. No signature. Just a subject line that read, unauthorized use of community amenities. I opened it. They claimed the lake had been verbally represented to new homeowners as a shared recreational feature. They cited long-standing community understanding and accused me of hostile noncompliance. And then, the cherry on top, they demanded I cease fishing activities immediately or face further enforcement actions. I laughed out loud. A real, belly-deep laugh that startled my dog off the couch. Verbal representation, community understanding, enforcement actions. None of those words mean a damn thing when a deed says otherwise. Still, laughter gave way to resolve. I replied with a single sentence. Please provide any legal documentation supporting your claim. I didn't expect an answer. What I got instead was a campaign. Over the next 2 weeks, HOA members began showing up near my fence line. Not crossing it, at least not yet, but standing there, arms folded, phones out, recording. Once, I found orange survey flags mysteriously planted a few feet inside my property. Another morning, a laminated private lake, residents-only sign appeared nailed to a tree near the shoreline. That one pushed me over the edge. I took it down, photographed it, and added it to a growing digital folder labeled HOA evidence. Then I called a lawyer. Her name was Marissa Kane, and she specialized in property rights and land use disputes. She listened quietly as I explained everything, occasionally asking for dates, names, copies of emails. When I finished, there was a pause on the line. Did they really call the police? She asked. Yes. And you have the incident report. I requested it the same day. Another pause. Then a small, dangerous smile crept into her voice. That was a mistake on their part, she said. A big one. We met in her office a week later. I brought everything. Deeds, maps, photos, the email, the incident report. She laid it all out on the table like an autopsy. They accuse you of criminal activity on land you legally own, she said. They misrepresented property boundaries to law enforcement, and they are continuing to harass you after being corrected. So what does that mean? I asked. It means this stopped being about fishing the moment they picked up the phone. She explained it plainly. False police reports, harassment, slander of title, intentional interference with property rights. Each one alone was serious. Together, they were explosive. And that's before we even talk about damages, she added. I leaned back in the chair. Damages like what? Well, she said, Tapping the lake photo, loss of enjoyment of property, emotional distress, legal costs. And if we uncover that they knowingly misled homeowners about access to this lake, she didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. The HOA wasn't just bullying me. They might have been lying to dozens of families who bought homes believing they had lake access they never legally owned. That's when I understood something important. This wasn't David versus Goliath. This was Goliath swinging wildly and hitting his own people. Marissa sent a formal cease and desist letter that same week. It outlined my property rights, warned against further contact, and demanded removal of any signage or communications claiming the lake as a community amenity. The response came 3 days later. They doubled down. The HOA president, a retired corporate manager who'd clearly mistaken a board position for a throne, sent a long, condescending letter accusing me of being unneighborly and obstructive to community harmony. He insisted the lake had always been treated as shared and suggested mediation, as long as I agreed to limit my fishing to designated hours. Marissa read it once and shook her head. "This is perfect," she said. "Perfect how?" "Perfect evidence." She filed a lawsuit the next morning. Once it became official, things escalated fast. HOA members started whispering. Some avoided me entirely. Others approached quietly, asking questions they were clearly afraid to ask out loud. Is it true the lake isn't actually ours? My realtor said, I paid extra for lake access. I didn't answer. Not out of spite, but because Marissa told me not to. Anything I said could be twisted. Behind the scenes, discovery began. Emails, internal HOA communications, meeting minutes. What they found was worse than we imagined. The board had known for years that the lake wasn't part of their development. A survey commissioned during the early planning stages confirmed it clearly, but marketing materials still described it as a shared natural feature. No correction was ever issued, no disclosures made. They weren't mistaken. They were gambling. And now, they were trapped by their own paper trail. The day Marissa called me with that discovery, her voice was calm but electric. They knew, she said, every single one of them. I walked down to the lake that evening as the sky turned orange and purple, the water catching fire with reflected light. I cast my line and watched the ripples spread. The HOA thought this was about a man fishing where he didn't belong. They were about to learn what happens when you challenge someone on land they do belong to and lie to everyone else along the way. The lawsuit didn't stay quiet for long. In a place like ours, nothing ever does. News traveled the way wind does in the valley, uneven, unpredictable, and impossible to stop. Within days of the filing, the HOA's neatly maintained facade began to crack, and the people living behind it started asking the one question the board feared most. What else haven't they told us? It started with a knock on my door just after sunset. I wasn't expecting anyone. Most folks had learned to keep their distance, not out of hostility, but out of uncertainty. Lawsuits make people nervous. I opened the door to find a middle-aged couple standing awkwardly on the porch, hands clasped, eyes darting like they were afraid someone might be watching. "Sorry to bother you," the man said. "We live over on Ridge Loop." I nodded. "What can I do for you?" They exchanged a glance. Then the woman spoke. "Is it true about the lake?" I stepped aside and let them in. We sat at the kitchen table, the same one where I'd first spread out my deeds weeks earlier. I didn't volunteer information. I just answered what they asked, carefully, truthfully, and without embellishment. Yes, the lake was entirely on my land. Yes, the surveys proved it. Yes, the HOA had been warned years ago. The man's shoulders slumped as if he'd been holding something heavy for a long time. "We paid an extra $40,000, he said quietly. The listing said lake access. They weren't the last. Over the next week, more neighbors came. Some angry, some confused, a few already furious at the board. One brought printed copies of old HOA newsletters boasting about exclusive lakeside living. Another showed me screenshots of the developer's website, now mysteriously edited, where the lake was featured front and center. I listened more than I spoke. What became clear was this. The HOA had sold a dream it didn't own, and now the bill was coming due. The board reacted exactly how Marissa predicted they would, with denial and intimidation. They sent out a mass email warning residents not to engage with the plaintiff. They framed the lawsuit as a frivolous personal grievance and accused me of trying to extort the community. That backfired. People don't like being told not to ask questions, especially when their savings are involved. The HOA's monthly meeting, usually a sleepy affair attended by the same 5 retirees, was suddenly standing room only. I didn't attend, but I didn't need to. Marisa had subpoenaed the meeting minutes, and what she showed me afterward was chaos on paper. Residents demanded explanations. The board dodged. Voices were raised. Someone accused the president of lying. Another demanded their dues back. A third threatened to call their own lawyer. The president ended the meeting early. That was a moment the HOA lost control. Discovery continued, and the evidence kept piling up. Emails between board members discussing how to manage perception. Notes about removing survey references from marketing packets. One particularly damning message from years earlier read, "If we disclose the lake issue now, sales will suffer. We can address it later if needed." Later had arrived. Marisa amended the lawsuit, adding claims of fraud and misrepresentation. The potential damages ballooned overnight. What had started as a property dispute was now a full-blown legal wildfire. The HOA tried to settle. Their first offer was laughable. They proposed a shared use agreement, limited access for residents, certain hours, certain activities, in exchange for dropping the suit. No admission of wrongdoing. No compensation. Marisa didn't even bring it to me. "They are not negotiating," she said. "They are panicking." The second offer came a week later. Money this time. A 6-figure number. Still with conditions. Still without an apology. I thought about it longer than I expected. Not because I doubted my case, but because I knew accepting would end things quietly. The board would survive. The truth would stay buried. And the families who bought into a lie would never see justice. I declined. That decision changed how people looked at me. Some called me stubborn. Others called me principled. A few called me dangerous. But quietly, more and more neighbors started siding with me, not because they loved me, but because the HOA had become the bigger threat. Then came the depositions. One by one, board members sat across from Marisa and answered questions under oath. Some were evasive. Some were defensive. One broke down in tears when confronted with an email she didn't remember writing but couldn't deny sending. The HOA president fared the worst. He insisted he'd acted in good faith. Marisa slid a printed survey across the table, the same one he'd signed off on approving years earlier. "Can you read the highlighted section aloud?" she asked. He did. It stated plainly, "Lake lies entirely outside HOA-managed parcels." The room went silent. From that point on, the case stopped being about whether I had the right to fish my lake. It became about how long the board had known they were lying and how many people they'd hurt by doing it. The local news picked it up next. At first, it was a small article buried in the regional section. Then a follow-up. Then a headline. Homeowners claim HOA misled buyers over lake access. Cameras showed up near the development entrance. Reporters requested comments. The board declined. Residents didn't. Interviews aired with families who felt betrayed. Retirees who'd invested their life savings. Young couples who'd planned their future around that water. And always, in the background, footage of the lake. Quiet, pristine, undeniably mine. I stopped fishing there for a while. Not because I was afraid, but because it felt like the lake had become a symbol, and I didn't want to cheapen it. Instead, I walked at shoreline in the evenings, listening to the frogs and watching the light fade. One night, as I stood there, I realized something that surprised me. I wasn't fighting the HOA anymore. They were fighting their own reflection. The lawsuit had cracked open a truth they'd spent years covering up, and now everyone could see it. The neighbors weren't united against me. They were united against a lie. And the closer the court date crept, the more desperate the board became. They started blaming each other. They started resigning. And they started to understand, far too late, that calling the police over a man fishing his own lake was the first domino in a chain they could no longer stop. The real cost wasn't just going to be financial. It was going to be reputational, legal, and permanent. And it was coming fast. By the time the case reached the courthouse, the HOA barely resembled the confident little empire that had once mailed out fines and threats like holiday cards. 2 board members had resigned. The president was still clinging to his position, but only because stepping down now would look like an admission of guilt, and everyone knew it. The remaining board meetings were closed-door phase, fueled by panic and legal invoices that stacked up faster than snowdrifts in January. For me, life had settled into a strange rhythm. Mornings on the ranch, afternoons answering emails from Marissa or reviewing documents, evenings walking the lake. The stress was there, but it was quieter now, tempered by something steadier, certainty. When the truth is on your side, you don't need to rehearse it. You just need to show up. The courthouse was an unremarkable concrete building, the kind that tries to look neutral and ends up looking tired. Still, the moment I walked through the doors, I felt the weight of it. This was an enabling disagreement anymore. This was accountability with fluorescent lighting. The HOA arrived together, like a nervous flock. Their attorney walked a few steps ahead, shoulders stiff, briefcase gripped too tightly. None of them looked at me. Not one. Marissa did. "You ready?" she asked. I nodded. "Let's finish this." Opening arguments were clean and brutal. The HOA's attorney tried to frame the case as a misunderstanding blown out of proportion by stubbornness on both sides. He used words like confusion, miscommunication, good faith. He avoided the word lie like it was radioactive. Marissa didn't. She laid out the timeline calmly, methodically, the surveys, the marketing materials, the internal emails, the police report, each piece connected to the next with a clarity that felt almost surgical. "This is not a dispute over access," she told the court. "This is a case about knowingly misrepresenting property rights, weaponizing authority to intimidate a landowner, and attempting to retroactively claim what was never theirs." When she mentioned the police call, I saw the judge's eyebrows lift, just slightly, but enough. That detail mattered. The witnesses followed. The county surveyor testified first. Neutral, unemotional. He pointed to maps and explained boundaries like he was describing gravity. The lake was mine. Always had been. Then came the real estate agent who'd helped sell several of the HOA homes. She squirmed under questioning, admitting she'd been provided marketing materials that described lake access. When asked whether she'd ever verified that claim, she hesitated. "No," she said quietly. The HOA president took the stand after lunch. He looked smaller up there, stripped of his title and authority, just another man in a suit answering questions he didn't like. Marissa walked him through his role, his responsibilities, his knowledge of the survey. "Did you read this document when it was presented to the board?" she asked. "Yes." "And did it state that the lake was outside HOA jurisdiction?" "Yes." Yet the HOA continued to advertise lake access. He shifted. "We believe the community understanding." Marissa cut him off. "This is a yes or no question." "Yes." The courtroom felt suddenly very still. Then came the police officer. He testified about the call, the report, the confusion, the eventual verification of my ownership. He was professional, fair, and clearly uncomfortable being there at all. Did the caller indicate they believed a crime was being committed? Marissa asked. "Yes." "And in your professional opinion, was there any crime?" "No." The judge leaned forward slightly. That was the hinge moment, the point where annoyance turned into concern. By the time closing arguments rolled around, the HOA's defense had collapsed into damage control. They begged for leniency. They warned of financial hardship. They painted themselves as volunteers who'd made mistakes. Marissa stood and delivered the quietest closing I'd ever heard, and the most devastating. "Power does not excuse deception," she said, "and volunteer status does not shield anyone from accountability. This case exists because the defendants chose intimidation over honesty, and when confronted, they chose denial over correction. The judge took the case under advisement. Waiting for the decision was harder than I expected. Days passed, then weeks. The lake froze. Snow fell. Life went on in that slow, inevitable way it always does. Then the call came. Marissa didn't waste time. "We won," she said, "on every major claim." I sat down. The court found willful misrepresentation, harassment, and abuse of process, she continued. Damages were awarded. How much? I asked. She named the number. $1.2 million. I closed my eyes. The money wasn't just for me. It included restitution funds earmarked for affected homeowners, legal fees, and punitive damages. The judge's opinion was scathing, particularly regarding the police call. The defendants, the ruling stated, used law enforcement as a tool of intimidation in a civil dispute where they lacked legal standing. That sentence alone made the case a reference point. The HOA didn't appeal. They couldn't afford to. Within months, the association was dissolved. Its remaining funds were drained. Former board members faced separate civil claims from homeowners. The development restructured under new management, stripped of illusions and promises. As for me, I didn't change much. I fixed a fence, bought a new dock, donated part of the settlement to a local land trust that helps protect private property rights. And one morning, when spring finally cracked the ice, I went back to fishing. The lake was quiet again. No sirens, no signs, no watchers at the fence line. Just water, sky, and the steady pull of the line in my hands. The court had spoken. The lie had been exposed. And the cost of that one phone call, the one meant to scare me off my own land, had finally been paid in full. But the story wasn't over yet. Not for the neighbors, and not for the lesson that would outlive all of us. Section 5. After the fall. Victory doesn't arrive with fireworks. It arrives quietly, usually on a weekday morning, when the world expects you to go back to normal. That was the strangest part. After months of tension, courtrooms, and whispered conversations, there was no grand finale, just silence where the HOA used to be. The email stopped first. No more warnings. No more community updates. No more passive-aggressive reminders about harmony and cooperation. One day my inbox was cluttered with legal correspondence, and the next it was empty. The HOA's website went offline shortly after. Their social media pages vanished like they'd never existed. It was eerie. 4 years, that organization had been omnipresent, posting rules, collecting dues, asserting authority. And now it was gone, erased by its own arrogance. Power, I learned, is fragile when it isn't earned. The neighbors didn't disappear, though. They changed. The first to approach me after the ruling was the same couple who'd knocked on my door months earlier. This time, they didn't look nervous. They looked relieved. "Thank you," the woman said. "I know you didn't do this for us, but still." I nodded. "I didn't do it against you either." That seemed to matter. Slowly, conversations reopened. People waved again. Some stopped to talk. A few apologized for things they'd said or assumed. I didn't hold grudges. There was no point. Fear makes people choose sides quickly, and the HOA had been very good at weaponizing fear. What surprised me most was how many residents admitted they'd always suspected something was off. The rules never applied equally. They fined people for things that made no sense. They acted like they owned everything. The lake had just been the most visible lie. The settlement funds were distributed under court supervision. Some homeowners recovered part of what they'd overpaid. Others used the money for legal fees and separate actions against the former board. A few moved away altogether, disillusioned but wiser. The development itself changed names. New management came in, quiet, professional, cautious. They removed the old signage, rewrote the bylaws, and, most importantly, stopped pretending to control what they didn't own. They never contacted me, except once, through a lawyer, to formally acknowledge my property boundaries and request permission to install clearer fencing on their side. I agreed. Not because I owed them anything, but because clarity benefits everyone. Life on the ranch settled into something deeper than peace, vindication without bitterness. I worked the land, fixed what needed fixing, and spent more time outdoors than I had in years. Stress is a way of stealing hours from you without asking. Getting them back felt like a gift. One afternoon, a local reporter asked if I considered doing a follow-up story. "People see this as a cautionary tale," she said, "about HOA's overreaching." I thought about it. "Then tell it that way," I said, "but don't make me the hero." I just read my paperwork. That line made the article. What didn't make it was a quiet realization that followed me everywhere. This could have gone very differently. If I hadn't kept records. If I'd backed down. If I'd been intimidated by uniforms and official language. The HOA had counted on that. On compliance. On silence. They lost because they misjudged one thing: how dangerous the truth becomes once it's documented. The lake taught me that lesson every day. Water doesn't care who claims it. It reflects whatever stands before it, honestly and without apology. That's what the HOA never understood. You can control people for a while. You can intimidate them. But reality doesn't bend. It waits. By summer, word of the case had spread far beyond our valley. I heard from people in other states dealing with similar situations, HOAs asserting phantom rights, threatening fines, calling authorities. Some asked for advice. Others just wanted reassurance that standing your ground didn't always end badly. I told them the same thing every time. Read your documents. Know your boundaries. Don't let confidence replace legality. Confidence is cheap. Deeds are not. One evening, as the sun dipped low and turned the lake copper, I noticed something new. Kids laughing in the distance, on the other side of the fence, nowhere near my water. The sound carried easily, light and unburdened. That was the real victory. Not the money, not the ruling, but the return of something honest. No false promises, no stolen symbols. Just people living where they chose to live, with eyes open. I cast my line and felt a tug almost immediately. The trout fought hard, flashing silver beneath the surface before I ease it free and let it slip back into the water. Some things aren't meant to be owned beyond what they already are. The lake stayed. The truth stayed. And the echo of that one phone call, the one meant to scare me off my own land, became a lesson others would learn from, long after the HOA's name faded into paperwork and memory. There was only one section left to this story, and it wasn't about courts or money at all. It was about what happens when ordinary people remember they have the right to say no. Winning a lawsuit doesn't feel like the movies promise it will. There's no applause, no triumphant music swelling as you walk out of the courthouse. What you get instead is a slow exhale you didn't realize you'd been holding for months, maybe years. And once that breath is gone, something else settles in its place. Reflection. The money arrived in stages. Structured. Accounted for. Clean. Numbers on a screen that represented stress, sleepless nights, and a line that should never have been crossed. I handled it carefully. Paid the legal fees first. Set aside the restitution portion exactly as ordered. Donated what I'd promised to the land trust. The rest went untouched for a long time, sitting there like a reminder that justice, when it comes, carries weight. But money wasn't the real aftermath. The real aftermath was psychological. 4 months after the ruling, I found myself listening harder than before. A truck slowing on the road made me glance up. A stranger near the fence line tightened something in my chest. It took time to accept that the threat was gone, that no one was going to knock on my door with a clipboard and a false sense of authority. Marissa warned me this might happen. You were targeted, she said. Even when you win, your nervous system doesn't forget that right away. She was right. I'd always thought of myself as independent, thick-skinned. Alaska tends to shape people that way. But there's something uniquely invasive about being told, officially, confidently, that what's yours isn't. It gets under your skin in ways cold weather never could. The neighbors were adjusting too. Without the HOA acting as a social referee, people had to figure things out on their own. Some thrived. Others struggled. A few tried to recreate the old structure, forming informal committees and discussion groups. They fizzled out quickly. Authority, once broken, doesn't reassemble easily. I stayed out of it. The lake became my anchor again. Not as a battleground or a symbol, but as what it had always been, a place where the world slowed down enough for thoughts to untangle. I started fishing in the mornings again, not every day, but often enough that it felt normal. One morning, a man approached the fence while I was packing up. He didn't cross it, just stood there, hands in his pockets. "Mind if I ask you something?" he said. I nodded. "Do you hate us?" he asked. The question caught me off guard. "No," I said honestly. "I never did." He nodded slowly. "A lot of people think you did this to punish the neighborhood." I leaned on the tailgate of my truck. I did it to stop being punished by it. He considered that, then thanked me and walked away. That exchange stayed with me longer than most, because it highlighted something I hadn't fully articulated yet. This was never about revenge. It was about boundaries. And boundaries, once crossed without consequence, invite worse behavior next time. The former HOA board members faded from public view. One moved out of state. Another quietly sold their house at a loss. I heard rumors of strained marriages, broken friendships, reputations that followed them farther than they expected. I didn't celebrate that. Consequences don't need an audience. What mattered was precedent. Lawyers began referencing the case in similar disputes. A county official told me, off the record, that training materials had been updated to address misuse of law enforcement in civil property conflicts. Even the police department adjusted how HOA-related calls were screened. That surprised me. A single fishing line cast into a quiet lake had rippled much farther than I'd imagined. The ranch felt bigger somehow after all of it. Not in acreage, but in presence, like it had reasserted itself. I repaired old trails, cleared brush, and rebuilt a dock that had been half-rotted for years. Physical work helped. It reminded me that the land responds to effort, not paperwork. One evening, as I sat on the new dock watching the sun bathe low, I thought about how easily this story could have ended differently. If I'd apologized when I'd done nothing wrong. If I'd stopped fishing to keep the peace. If I'd assumed the HOA must be right because they sounded official. That's how overreach survives, through reasonable people choosing silence over friction. I didn't feel brave for standing my ground. I felt tired, but tired was better than erased. A letter arrived late that summer from a couple who'd moved away after the ruling. They thanked me for exposing the truth, even though it had cost them their dream home. We would rather know, they wrote, than live inside a lie. I folded that letter carefully and put it in the same folder as a deed. Both mattered. By fall, the valley had settled into itself again. Leaves turned. Frost returned. The lake hardened at the edges, patient as ever. I walked the perimeter one last time before winter set in fully, boots crunching over frozen grass. Nothing marked the spot where the police cruiser had parked months earlier. No scar. No sign. Just land doing what land has always done, outlasting human nonsense. I realized then that the real cost of that HOA phone call wasn't just $1.2 million. It was trust. Trust between neighbors. Trust in institutions. Trust that authority means legitimacy. They'd spent years spending it carelessly, and one morning, they ran out. As winter closed in, I felt something I hadn't felt since before the first letter ever arrived. Contentment without vigilance. The kind that lets you sleep deeply and wake without rehearsing arguments in your head. The story was almost finished. One final section remained. Not about conflict, but about the lesson that lingered long after the court files were archived. A lesson written not in legal language, but in water, land, and the simple act of standing still when someone tries to move you. The first spring after everything ended arrived quietly. No announcements. No meetings. No envelopes slid under doors. Just a slow, stubborn return of green along the lake's edge and the sound of ice breaking apart in long, hollow cracks. I stood on the shore one morning and watched the last sheet drift free, spinning lazily before melting back into the water it had borrowed itself from. It felt like a beginning, not an ending. I carried my fishing rod down to the same spot where the sirens had first cut through the fog. I hadn't planned it that way. It just happened. Places remember things even when people try not to. The mud was softer now, the grass newly awake. I cast my line and let it settle, watching the ripples expand and disappear. That was the moment the story finally made sense to me. This was never about a lake. Not really. It was about lines, who gets to draw them, who respects them, and what happens when someone decides they don't apply. The HOA thought authority came from titles and paperwork. I learned that day it comes from clarity and refusal. A line in the water is a funny thing. It's delicate, almost invisible, and yet it holds firm against pressure when you don't jerk it in panic. The valley had changed since the lawsuit, but not in ways you could photograph. There were fewer signs, fewer fences that made no sense. Conversations were more direct. When disagreements happened, people talked instead of hiding behind committees. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest. That honesty mattered. Every so often, someone new would move into the area and hear the story secondhand. They'd ask me about it if they saw me by the lake. Is it true they called the cops on you? Yes. Is it true they lost everything? Mostly. They usually expected anger or pride in my answers. What they got instead was neutrality. I didn't win because I was tougher than anyone else. I won because I didn't move when I was told to move without reason. That distinction matters. One afternoon, I found a small wooden sign near the edge of my property, facing inward, not outward. Someone had carved it carefully. It read, "Boundaries matter. No name. No explanation." I left it where it was. As years pass, stories like this tend to warp. They get simplified, turned into slogans. HOA goes too far. Man beats corrupt board. Those versions miss the point. The real danger wasn't the HOA itself. It was how easily people accepted its authority without asking where it came from. Most overreach doesn't start with villains. It starts with confidence unchallenged. I've replayed that morning 1,000 times in my head. The sirens, the officer's hand near his holster, the assumption of guilt. If I reacted emotionally, raised my voice, or backed away, the story might have ended there, written off as another small conflict in a quiet place. Instead, I stood still. Standing still is harder than it sounds. It invites scrutiny, pressure, escalation, but it also forces truth to do the heavy lifting. The lake taught me that. Water doesn't argue. It doesn't justify itself. It just exists, and in doing so, exposes everything around it. I still fish there often. Not every day, but enough to keep the rhythm. Sometimes I catch something. Sometimes I don't. That part doesn't matter much anymore. What matters is a feeling of casting without fear, without wondering who might appear, clipboard in hand, ready to tell me I don't belong. Belonging isn't granted. It's recognized. I had people ask what advice I'd give to anyone dealing with an HOA or any authority that's pushing past its limits. I always say the same thing. Know what's yours. Document everything. Don't confuse politeness with compliance. And above all, don't let anyone rewrite reality just because they sound official. The $1.2 million headline will fade. Numbers always do, but the precedent remains. The reminder remains. Somewhere, another person is standing on land they own, being told they don't belong there. I hope this story reaches them before they step aside. As the sun dropped behind the trees that morning, I reeled in my line and stood quietly, listening to the familiar sounds. The wind in the branches, the water lapping gently at the shore, the distant call of a bird I never bothered to name. The lake didn't care about lawsuits or settlements. It didn't care about HOAs or power struggles. It cared only about being what it was. So did I. And that was a final lesson. When you stop trying to prove your right to exist where you already belong, the noise fades. The truth surfaces. And all that's left is a quiet certainty that some lines, once drawn, don't need to be defended again. I packed up my gear and walked back toward the house, the wooden sign catching the last light behind me. Boundaries matter. They always have. And they always will.